that is now acting like it is free floating.
I'll be back in a year, 'cause I'm in the Army.
Next on our to-do list is going to be to pull the drivetrain, including the radiator, transmission, transfer case. So I think, realistically, the first thing we're going to have to do is get the radiator out, and we're going to need to disconnect some drive shafts, and then likely go ahead and separate transmission from the transfer case, or transmission from the engine, and then we'll deal with the transfer case at the back end. So first things first is going to be to start here at the radiator. So the radiator has already been drained, so in theory there's nothing in the radiator hose here to need to further drain. We'll see if that proves true. I think the order of operations though is going to be to disconnect that hose, and then we'll go ahead and remove the radiator. It's a reasonably good sign, no fluid coming out. That wasn't the hose I actually meant to disconnect. That's a heater hose that goes up to the top of the motor. What I wanted is this one, which is the other end of the radiator hose. This was a brand new hose, so I'm actually kind of surprised that it's already adhered. Okay, so that is the other side of that off. Radiator seems to be sitting on tab here, and a tab here. That's steering. So it's the bolt right in here behind the shock, coming in underneath the radiator here, just forward of the other. Okay. This is a little bit smaller bolt. Smaller on the bottom as well. Since this one is a little bit less likely to be something that is actually part of the radiator, and use the impact to kind of spin through all the rust. Now what's interesting is that the theory is that was everything that was holding the radiator on. And I would have expected it to try to fall over. And in fact, it is still quite attached, some way, somehow. We'll come in with a little bit of a prying instrument. It does suggest that it is mostly stiction that is holding it in place. There we go. Radiator is out. I'll set that aside for later use. So this cross member here is kind of not a normal piece on the CJ. And the welds on it look similar to the welds that we've seen elsewhere. On this side, they've got that little tab that the bumper was attached to. On the other side, the tab is not there. So, kind of an interesting side-to-side comparison. So on the front, we see this tubular cross member with the bumper removed. We'll get back here to the back. I've pulled the rear bumper off of this as well. And we see that on the back end of it, he is also, or the previous owner has also added a tubular cross member that is not normally present, as well as having removed the usual V-brace that is back here on the back of the Jeep. So just more evidence of the modifications that were made in its previous life. These additional cross members may in fact actually be functionally be improvements to the frame, because they look actually like heavier than the bracing that may have been there originally. Most likely though, they're there as a result of some kind of a break or repair that was necessary in its previous life. So now we're going to move on to pulling the engine, transmission, drivetrain. I think the order of operations here is going to be to go ahead and pull the bell housing bolts out of the transmission engine connection here, all of these around, and then we'll pull the engine mount bolts, which will then allow us to pull the engine out while leaving the transmission in the frame. The reason for doing that, if this was a good working drivetrain ready to drop into another frame, I would just pull it all as a unit. But in this case, I have to separate the engine and the transmission anyway in order to do the clutch. And we're going to need to figure out what the clutch is, whether it's appropriate to the old L134 or if the clutch is something else. So knowing that's got to come apart, I think it's going to be easier to go ahead and pull them apart while leaving the transmission attached to the frame. So we're going to start there and try to set up the camera so that can be watched, and we'll go from there. Bell housing bolts are, survey says, 9/16. It does not look like the starter bolts on this one protrude into that space. The bell housing bolts all appear to be just a straight up 9/16. I think that one is going to require a wrench. There's two springs here related to the clutch. One was a pretty light one. This heavier one, there we go. The heavier one was wrapped around the brake light switch for the on the front of the master cylinder. So with the springs removed, I have access to the bolt, and that is definitely threaded into the bell housing, not just sitting there, with plenty of torque on it. The impact is usually less prone to stripping the heads on bolts. That bolt really does not want to move. I'm going to lightly put the bolt that's adjacent to it here back in place. I'll let some penetrant work. I'm going to take off those two bolts on the bottom of the bell housing, or on the shield here. And just like that, we have the inspection plate off. That's going to make a convenient tray to hold all of our bolts. There it is. It's always amazing how much more leverage you can get just by putting a socket on the end of a nut or end of a bolt to be able to spin them out by hand. So that leaves the one on the other side that I needed the wobble for, in addition to the one that I put in as the temporary. So that should be all the bell housing bolts. The engine mount bolts are a little bit bigger. So on this side, it should be relatively straightforward to just spin this nut off. Just like so. I'm going to leave the nut just hand threaded onto the end so that it doesn't come loose when I'm not watching or wanting it to. The other side's going to require a little bit more effort because we need to work between the starter and the motor mount, and the motor mount and the oil filter. But it's basically the same idea. Just wanting to back the nut off so that when we get in here with the hoist, it's just a matter of taking the weight off and then being able to pull the bolts out. Go ahead and take this ground strap off just so it's out of the way, or not. It doesn't want to just slide off. It's acting like it's threaded on there, so we'll take it off in a minute. All right, I think the next up is to get in here with the hoist and the engine leveler. All right, we've got the engine hoist hooked up. We're actually using the exhaust manifold bolts on the engine as our attachment point. The bolts are kind of on the long side, but with a nut behind the washer, kind of works like a stud. Thread it in until the bolt bottoms out, and then tighten the nut up against the chain. With that, we're kind of to a point where we're ready to begin lifting the motor up. The idea here is to lift the engine, take the weight off the engine mounts, and we'll pull the bolts out of the engine mounts. And then, with those in place, we will go ahead and lift the engine the rest of the way out. Let's see how this goes. Like that, we're starting to take the weight off the frame. Take that motor mount out. See if the one on the other side is unloaded as well. That one doesn't want to just slide out yet. Try going up just a little bit more, see if that'll unload it. Feels like it. It's always kind of a fine balance between enough to take the weight off and too far, you actually start lifting the frame of the vehicle. It's close, but I think we need just a little bit more. Yeah, that's better. So now we're going to lift the engine up. We have to clear the horns on the frame, or the engine brackets there on the frame, and see if we can slide it forward. And we've got a gap in here with the brackets. So now we want to see if we can start to separate the engine from the bell housing. Got a little bit of a separation starting to form on this side, so we're going to start here. The idea is just to get a wedge in if we can, and encourage the bell housing to separate from the engine block. Let's give this a wiggle. So what we're trying to do is get a separation to go between the bell housing and the engine block. And so far, no joy. Try applying some pressure with the clutch and see if that will make it want to pop out. Given that part of the reason we're doing this is because the clutch is frozen up, it is entirely possible that the end of the transmission shaft is also frozen into the end of the clutch. This may require a bit of doing, though it may be possible to get in here and actually take the clutch loose from the flywheel itself if it doesn't want to give. Well, I succeeded in getting the clutch linkage disconnected. Wanting something in here to pry against. Don't want to pry on anything so hard as to potentially break, but at the same time, there we go. It wiggled. And now we have a gap. That is now acting like it is free floating. So we've got a gap and an engine that slides out. So then we should be able to raise the engine up a bit more. just like that, we have the engine out. Transmission is there. And there's the body. All in one place.